Today we've got Neal Wininger, a feed and forage consultant with Dairyland Labs out of Arcadia, Wisconsin. Neal grew up on a dairy farm in central Wisconsin. He earned his BS in broad area ag at UW River Falls. He's been in dairy nutrition consulting for nearly 17 years and with Dairyland Labs for the past 7 years as a feed and forage consultant. Neal, I know you have done this twice before for us, and we always appreciate the information that you bring and the updates you bring for our silage information. So, as I always say, podium is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Fred. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to present for your webinar here and talking about forage quality and specifically looking at the 2023 crop year and how that compares to some historical data. So with that, we'll jump right into it. So I guess quick agenda, primarily focusing on corn silage quality, but then I'll dabble a little bit with what we're seeing with alfalfa haylage and then some of the alfalfa grass mix haylages. So with that, jumping into corn silage, I like to share Dr. Bill Weiss's slide here. It's a good visual on partitioning where most of your energy is coming from potentially with corn silage. As you see, around 42% of the energy is potentially coming from starch or the corn grain portion of corn silage. And then the next big piece of the pie there is the NDF, or the potential for fiber digestion or fiber digestibility out of that NDF. So with that, over 70% of the potential energy on average coming from starch and NDF, which those are the big players with our corn silages. So we'll certainly take a look at what those values are doing here through the lab. As you can see here, so here's the 2023 new crop corn silage. We have around 63,000 plus samples thus far through the laboratory, or through our lab network. As you can see, kind of going down through these major nutrients that I included, not a lot of change from the new crop 2023 versus the 3-year data. Moisture, pretty much similar there, pretty close to that 64-65% moisture neighborhood. Crude protein, we're right on the same exact median value at 7.9, so fairly typical on that part of it. Then we move on here to NDF. So NDF, there is a slight downturn in the NDF values of the new crop 36.3% versus the 3-year data at 37.1. So just a slightly down, but then I'll point out the starch. Typically starch is inverse to where the NDF is. So typically if you have more corn grain or more starch in the sample, you'll have a little lower NDF. So we have that slight uptick in starch, about a point higher starch on average versus the NDF being down about almost a point. Next in line here, the NDF-D or NDF digestibility at 30 hours. We are seeing a slight downturn in the average NDF digestibility, which is we'd obviously like to see it on average heading the other direction, but still within reason. So it's down about 2 points NDF-D versus the 3-year data, but still in general, corn silage obviously brings a lot to the plate there with that NDF digestibility potential. Next in line, UNDF 240. Obviously the UNDF is undigestible or indigestible NDF at 240 hours. That's obviously going to be inverse to the NDF-D. So we have a slight uptick in the UNDFs. but still in general within reason compared to the historical data. Then next here, I'll touch on the ash, slightly the lower the ash level, the better in general. A lot of that ash would be natural minerals coming within the plant, but also some negative contribution could be coming from soil contamination. So the slightly lower levels of ash is a good thing, kind of an indicator of a little less ash on average. Not a huge change, but certainly headed in the right direction. And then lastly, the milk per ton, which has been a pretty good index in ranking corn silage quality. Milk per ton accounts for protein, fiber, fat, ash, NDF digestibility, but the biggest players there would be the starch content in the NDF and NDF digestibility. So on average, the milk per ton is pretty similar to the historical data, 3,500 pounds of milk versus 3,464 pounds. So a slight uptick there, but not a huge change. The slight uptick is because of the added starch, even though the NDFD is down a little bit. So they kind of offset one another to a certain extent. Next slide here, broke out the Iowa specific samples here for this presentation. As you can see, we found 2,500 samples, or a little over 2,500 samples thus far of new crop Iowa samples. And I'm comparing the Iowa 23 samples versus the entire database that we have for 2023 samples. The first thing I'll point out there is it looks like on average the Iowa samples are a touch drier, the average being 62 versus 64 and a half. So just wanted to point that out a little bit there. But next in line, the crude protein is a little more positive with the Iowa samples versus our entire database of what we're seeing here. Not a huge difference there again, but certainly positive versus our entire database. Again, NDF in the similar realm there, 35 to 36, just a slightly lower NDF versus all samples. But then again, I'll point out the starch content is slightly higher at 35.6 versus the entire database at 35. So again, a slightly uptick in the amount of corn grain or starch content, with the NDF being a little bit lower. NDFD, the Iowa samples are slightly higher than the entire database at 58.8 versus 58.4. So that's a good thing for the Iowa samples compared to all samples. And there again, the UNDF is inverse to the NDFD, a touch lower than the entire database. Lastly, the milk per tons, again, we're pretty similar on milk per tons versus all samples, with that slight uptick in the starch versus the NDF going down. The next slide here, comparing the Iowa 23 samples versus Iowa 2022 samples. Again, kind of the similar trends we're seeing with the NDF digestibility is slightly lower this year versus last year's crop, 58.8 versus 60.5. Other than that, again, I'll point out that moisture content, and the reason I'm pointing out that moisture content does concern me a little bit, of course, with higher starch, and not that it's generally a good thing to see higher starch, but we also want starch digestibility, which I'll dive into here in a little bit. But certainly total plant moisture can play a role in how available or digestible that starch can potentially be. The next slide here broke out our BMR, or all the BMR varieties here in the brown area on the slide here. as you'll see in general, obviously the BMRs on average are higher digestibility with the NDFDs in that 67% area versus all samples are in that 58 area. So, as expected, the BMRs are higher, but they are a slight downturn versus the 3-year historical data, which kind of matches the entire database being a touch lower on NDFD. But not as big a swing down with the BMRs versus all samples. And then again, the starch, I'll point out the starch is slightly higher with the BMRs this year at 33.4 versus 32.7. And then lastly, the milk per ton is in the general similar realm at 3,700 pounds of milk per ton versus 3,687. So in general, year to year, not huge changes, but some slight changes here and there. Here I'm just kind of showing some of the general normal distributions of samples for some of the major nutrients in our corn silages. In general, your starches, as I kind of went through, there's starches are in the mid 30s. Most of the samples are going to fall in that 25 to 45 with a fair majority in the 30 to 40 neighborhood. And then the NDFs, of course, like I mentioned earlier, the higher the starch, the lower the NDF, or vice versa in general. Most of our NDFs are going to be falling in that 30 to 45 area. Next here, I'm going to dive into starch digestibility, which I kind of briefly touched on earlier. This slide shows kind of a scatter graph over a year's time on the average in vitro starch digestibility at 7 hours, and plotted them by month running from September through August, so a full year's data points. And I guess the main point of this slide is the brown average is the trend line over time. And as you see at the beginning, the left side of the slide here is when we see kind of that fall slump, if you will, when we have more of the fresh corn silages and early fermented corn silages. So that's kind of the main point there is that we see that virtually every fall, some of those, fresh and early fermented corn silages having a little lower starch digestibility values. My next slide here, as I've done previous years, broke out all the corn silages that we ran from September through November of 2023 versus the previous year, September through November 2022. And that included a little over 43,000 samples so far. As you'll see, the average or median in vitro 7-hour value of 68.9. Again, very similar to last year's data. The normal distribution with the mins and maxes, again, pretty similar to last year's data. Yeah, but I'll point out, if you're down on that lower end of the spectrum in the mid 50s, that certainly can affect how well that corn silage is going to feed if the 7-hour starch value is in the mid 50s versus once you're getting up into the 70s and 80 area. Next in line, of course, is corn silage processing scores can have a big impact on that starch availability. So here we're plotting the average corn silage processing score that we see over time, going all the way back to 2012 through current. And as you can see, the general trend line over time, when we went way back to 2012, the average was just over 60 for a CSPS score. And currently, you can see that even last year, we kind of peaked at close to over 70, but we see a slight downtick with the huge amount of fresh corn silage samples that came in the fall here. But in general, obviously, the industry's made a lot of improvements with processing our corn silages in general. But certainly keep that in mind as far as how well that starch can feed. Particle size is a huge factor there. Here's just a little bit different way of looking at the corn silage processing score data. Here's our normal distribution, what we see through the lab. The gray area being inadequately processed at less than 50 for a corn silage processing score. And the blue area is 50 to 70. And then the green area is over 70, which, that's considered optimum to be over 70. And that's kind of the goal, is to be over 70. And some of the newer goals are even, setting them higher and higher. So, but in general here, obviously this distribution over time has gotten better and better in general from year to year. So another step here in evaluating starch digestibility is, of course, looking at some fecal starch data through the lab. Here again, going back to 2012 through current data with the trend line, the average fecal starch over time, way back to 2012, the average fecal starch was around 7%. And here again, the gray area would be samples that are over 5% fecal starch, and the blue area is 3 to 5, and then the green area is 0 to 3. And of course, the goal, obviously, the lower the better. And we'd really like to be in that green area. But if you're in the blue or gray areas, obviously there's might be some areas to search out in the diets to see if we can improve some starch digestibility. Here's just kind of our normal distribution of fecal starch samples through the lab. Again, the green area is the 0 to 3% fecal starches, and the blue is the 3 to 5, and the gray is the over 5% fecal starches. In general, obviously the bigger brunt of samples is in that 0 to 3 area, which has improved over time. But obviously you can see there's a long leg to the right there. There's still some concerning samples that get out there over 10, 15, 20% fecal starch, which is very significant. And I guess enough on hitting on starch. So next is, there's always some talk about concern about toxins in the new crop silage. Certainly don't want to, just more of an awareness here. Looking at new crop vomitoxin levels through the lab so far. The data is fairly limited on sample volumes at this point, but just kind of want to raise an awareness. In general, we're pretty similar to previous years as far as samples that are negative or less than 0.1 ppm vomitoxin. I will point out there is a slight uptick on samples that are over that 2.5, and even samples that are over 6 ppm on the vomitoxin. And again, just an awareness. It is limited sample data, and it's hard to say whether that's a normal distribution of samples that would come in for vomitoxin, since most of those samples are, samples that maybe people have concern about toxins and not necessarily a normal variation or normal distribution of samples. But like I say, it does seem like there's a few more higher levels that we're seeing, but certainly keep that in mind as you're feeding new crop silage. I guess hit enough on new crop silage here thus far. I'm going to move on to alfalfa haylage this year. So far, we're seeing over 23,000 samples through the lab network. In the green area, there's the 2023 new crop samples versus the 3-year data. And again, obviously we're seeing samples from a pretty wide geography, and not seeing huge differences in the normal distribution of samples on these nutrients, but certainly seeing some slight changes over time here. I guess the one I'll point out here is the NDF digestibility again. We're seeing a little bit of a negative trend there on NDFD, but not huge. 46.9 versus the 3-year data at 48.3. So a slight downtick in the NDFD there and a slight uptick, which is inverse. The UNDF is up slightly. But in general, the RFV is up about 3 points since the NDF and the ADF are down slightly, and just a slight uptick in the RFQs with that as well. Here I broke out the Iowa samples, Iowa alfalfa haylage samples. We got over 1,000 samples thus far. As you see here, the NDFD, it's a little bit higher than our entire database of samples. But in general, it did trend down slightly, but it's still the new crop samples in Iowa are a little higher than the total Dairyland database. RFV, obviously very similar at 156 versus 155 on average, and the RFQ about 4 points higher, 167 versus 163. Here I'm breaking off the, again, the new crop Iowa samples versus last year's Iowa specific samples, just to compare kind of your own data in Iowa. There again, kind of mentioned when I looked at all of Dairyland's data, the NDFD, we did see a slight downtick in NDFD versus previous historical data. So we did see that in Iowa specific samples, just a slight downtick here in the NDFDs. And then, of course, the inverse again with the UNDF slightly up. But all in all, the RFE is up slightly because the NDF is lower, even though the NDFD is also lower. We did see an uptick in that RFE and RFQ because of that lower NDF there. Here, I'm just kind of displaying some of the normal distributions of some of our major nutrients in the alfalfa haylages. Obviously the protein is a big player in our alfalfa haylages. Most of the samples fall in that 17 to 25 neighborhood, with the brunt of the a large majority in 19 to 23. Again, the NDFs falling in the lower to low 30s to upper 30s. NDFDs, again, in that 42 to 55 covers most of the samples. Next in line here, kind of broke out what we consider mixed haylage or alfalfa grass mixes cover most of these samples. So far, we're seeing a little over 12,000 samples in this category. In this category, we see a slight downturn in the overall crude protein, not a huge difference, 18.7 versus 19.5 on the historical samples. It's just a slight downturn in the average crude protein. Slight uptick on the NDFs. But with that, we also saw a slight uptick in the NDFD. And I think part of this is seeing maybe a slight uptick in the percentage of grass in this category. With the slight uptick in the NDF, slight downtick in the protein, and a slight uptick in the NDF digestibility. Next year, I broke out the Iowa specific alfalfa grass mix haylages. Keep in mind here, I did only find 105 samples in this category that were specifically submitted from Iowa, so it is a little limited on the data. Like one thing I would point out with this limited data, we did see on these samples a little drier on the Iowa samples versus the entire database. Protein fairly similar, but again, a little lower, 18.1 versus 18.7. Here, a slight uptick in the NDF, the total NDF value, and a slight downtick in the NDFD. But in general, the RFE and that are in a similar realm. Here, I broke out the 2023 Iowa specific alfalfa grass samples versus the 2022 to compare Iowa new crop versus old crop data. Here we actually saw an uptick in the protein versus last year's Iowa samples. and 1 point lower on the NDF, but 1 point lower, or around 1 point lower on the NDFD. But with that, we did see a little improvement on the RFV, since we saw a lower ADF and NDF, but an improvement on your RFQs with that. And with that, I probably went a little bit fast on the slides, but certainly I can open it up for any questions or comments at this point. And if Brad wanted to grab it.
Thank you, Neal. We have a small group. If those in attendance want to just unmute their mic and go ahead and ask questions, we will kind of wait just a moment and see if that happens.
Okay.
We've been dealing here in the upper Midwest with drought conditions for, I believe this is the fourth year. Have you noticed with that continued droughts, any trend line changes that, maybe you weren't expecting on a corn silage?
Well, I think, that's a good question. I think it's hard to parse that out sometimes because, like I say, when you look at the entire data across our network, things kind of even out, if you will. Certainly specific geographies will see larger potential changes with, droughts or weather changes from year to year. But when you look across our entire network, some of those changes are washed out with, other geographies, having opposite change in weather. But like you say, looking at the Iowa specific samples, you could kind of see some of that where you do see potentially a little more changes, but even there, you do see some of that washout because of the volume of samples and seeing from a larger geography.
Okay, very good. We always are talking about cover crops and new forage sources. Are you seeing more sorghum coming in? I know we focused on corn and alfalfa, but any comments come to mind on sorghum?
Yeah, I definitely think there's definitely more more samples for sorghum Sudan grasses coming through the lab, I think year over year. Um, I also believe there's more of what are considered quote unquote cocktail mixes that may include sorghum Sudan grass or a variety of forage, grasses and maybe some legumes in there as well. So it does seem like, yeah, there's going to be some more in that category. And then, you brought up cover crops. Certainly we're seeing more cover crop type forages as well. And I would expect that to grow as time moves forward. And certainly the quality on some of those can be quite good, but we could also see with that, you can see some broader ranges of what some of those things can be also. Just because, well, some of those grasses, you can have a pretty broad range of, say, crude protein and even really NDF contents with maturity playing a huge factor, of course.
Yep. And, when I was a young man, we always thought of sorghum as kind of a last resort type forage. Yeah, it'll feed heifers, it'll feed dry cows, but that's not the case anymore. We've got some really outstanding sorghums, don't we, as far as when you test them, how they compare?
Right. I think in general, yeah, you're spot on. I think the quality on some of those has in general gotten better. We do see some that are maybe a little high in fiber as well. So that's why, in general, I think the quality's gotten better, fiber digestibility. So I think in general they're probably fitting into diets, but there again depends on factors on the farms, whether they're, their forage inventories of corn silage versus haylage and how they fit those into diets.
Yep. In one of your slides with the corn silage, we saw the protein curve move to the right. What does that mean? It wasn't necessarily a lot higher, but it certainly moved the green bar to the right. What is that telling us?
Well, that would have been just a slight uptick in protein as far as the normal distribution of samples. But like I say, in general, yeah, not a huge change there.
Okay.
You bet.
Is the starch increase part of a multi-year trend?
Yeah, I think if you look back at previous summaries or even webinars like this, in general, yeah, starch has trended up. If you look back at say 5 years ago, or even 10 years ago, yeah, I think starch content in general has trended up. But obviously back to the Bill Weiss slide, starch, but then NDF and the digestibility of the NDF, obviously we kind of want, in my mind, some of both, right? We want we want a fair starch content, but we also want quality fiber and digestible fiber. And there again, depends on what the diet needs. There might be diets where you maybe err towards the, the samples that are a little higher in NDF, but higher NDF digestibility. Really depends on what the diet needs, I guess.
Exactly. We do this and it gives us a snapshot of an entire region for the year. And by no way is this replacing that monthly or every 2 week sample that our nutritionist takes and has you process. But it does give us kind of that 30,000 foot view of what did this year's crop look like. And we certainly appreciate that. Always enjoy having you go through the results from Dairyland Lab and kind of point some things out that look a little different or trend lines that are coming about. I don't see any other questions. If there are, we'll just ask the participants unmute and we'll go ahead and let them ask the question. If not, we thank you very much for your time presenting to us, Neal, and we appreciate all the folks who attended. Thank you again, and we will look forward to seeing folks at our program in January, where we'll take a look at weather and climate and what it looks like for the 2024 growing season. Thank you, Neal.
Thank you, Fred.